What's going on, folks? Ted from Immersion here, and we're back with another Top 10 Tuesday. This time, my patrons voted, and we're talking about Aberrations. So I'm giving you my top 10 D&D 5e Aberrations. The way this works is they have to be an aberration, and they have to be from 5e. I know that seems self-explanatory, but you'd be surprised. So I'm not going to be taking anything from other editions that are aberrations and bringing them in here. They're only things that have 5th edition stat blocks. Also, I'm going to be avoiding anything that is a truly unique thing, as in it's an NPC that happens to be an aberration or something like that, where it is one of a kind, because that's not truly, like, it is an aberration, but they're very specific. Like if it's an NPC from, I don't know, Rime of the Frost Maiden or Waterdeep Dragon Heist, I'm not including them here because they're only technically specific to that adventure. So that being said, this is also my top 10 list, which may be vastly different from yours, but it is what it is. So if you want to see what they are, stay tuned. Number 10. The Chaos Quadrapod. I wasn't even aware of this one, but it's too goofy and silly to not put on this list, which is why it's on number 10. Not normally what you think about when it comes to aberrations. Also, the description is as you would expect from an Acquisitions Incorporated monster, and I love that. So this is basically just a blob of tentacles that moves around, and obviously it's 4 because it's a quadrupod. Cluster of 4 sucker tentacles with a pulsing mass of ethereal light at its central body. The Chaos Quadrupod is a creature from the Far Realm and channels the anarchic power of the plane as it destroys its path. And it's here's the part, right? The quadrupod ambulates by flinging its mucus-covered tentacles out and dragging itself along, creating a horrid slurping sound as it advances relentlessly towards prey. So it's basically just a ball of tentacles, has magic resistance. These tentacles can grapple and restrain. And then it also has this interesting Chaos Cloud ability, which is recharges on a short or long rest, that shoots forth a knot of roiling ethereal light that explodes at a point within 60 feet, and each creature within a 20-foot radius of that point needs to make a charisma saving throw or be stunned. So while I think this thing can be dangerous enough on its own, if you were to pair this with something else, when it gets a stun attack based off of charisma, might be able to really seriously do some damage. Number 9. The Otyugh. I'll be honest, I forgot that these creatures were aberrations until I started making this video. These are one of my favorite monsters to throw at players. And yeah, it's on this list because of that. It is basically a large subterranean poop-eating monster. It's basically the best way I can put it. It says, right here, they can tolerate light, but they live in the darkness. And they can often form, which is another thing I kind of like, symbiotic relationships with cities, because they can basically be a garbage disposal, because they'll just eat whatever kind of junk happens. So you get one in your sewer and it keeps it kind of clean. What's something I feel like is often overlooked by a lot of people when they throw these at someone is this limited telepathy feature, which is they can magically transmit messages and images to a creature within 120 feet that can understand a language. And this is always like a fun thing, because if people don't know, and I feel like more often than not people don't, that an Otyugh has telepathy, they start freaking out, because like eventually this thing will attack them, but they won't necessarily put 2 and 2 together that this was the thing with telepathy. Plus it's like weird looking. It's got this big mouth and its eyes are on like a separate eye stalk tendril and these big sucker stinger pads. Obviously, being tied to waste and things, it has a lot of poison-based abilities, right? So its bite does decent damage and has an ability to poison people, and they become poisoned, but then every 24 hours, they have to repeat the saving throw or their max hit points are reduced. And then we have the tentacle attacks, which can do bludgeoning damage and piercing damage. And it's a grapple and restrain. And then if you're grappled by the tentacle, it also has this feature, which I would like to see more abilities like this in 5e, where like if one thing happens, then another happens. It seems like it's more often than not tied to tentacles, but I feel like there's other options to do with this as well. But if someone's grappled by it, it can slam them into something else or a solid surface. They make a con save or take bludgeoning damage and be stunned until the end of its next turn. On a success, they take half damage and aren't stunned. but it can make 3 attacks too, a bite and 2 tentacles. However, the tentacle slam is the only thing it can do on that turn. But again, nothing is more fun than beating one of your players down with another player. Number 8. It's iconic, and it's on the front cover of the monster manual, and that would be the Beholder, right? We can't not have Beholder on this list, right? There's no way to get around that. This is one of the quintessential Dungeons and Dragons monsters, the big floating eyeball with a bunch of smaller eyeballs, and they can be just an absolute terror to throw at your party, largely because of their large central eye, which produces an anti-magic cone that functions like the anti-magic field spell. So it's a 150-foot cone, so it's no small area, and basically it shuts down magic, spellcasting, as well as magic items in that area. The only downside to that is the Beholder's own eye rays do not work in that magical central eye cone. They have decent saving throws, they have a 360-degree vision, and they can fly. And then and they have a bite attack, which doesn't do a decent, small amount of damage, right? 46 piercing damage is nothing to laugh at. But the big thing is the eye rays, right? It chooses 3 eye rays at random. I always thought it was kind of weird that it does the eye rays at random, but maybe that would just be too much. Maybe that was the balance behind it. And then they do have legendary actions, which they can choose to use one of their 3 legendary actions to just do a random eye ray. So that mostly ends up being about 6 eye rays every round of combat. They also have lair actions as well if you happen to fight a Beholder in its lair. And they have some really interesting lore about them, obviously them being alien and coming from the far realm. Very cool. But the eye rays do a variety of different things, from charming, paralysis, fear effects, slow as the slow spell. Enervation just does necrotic damage. You have telekinesis to move stuff around. That's also how they use their hands. A sleep ray, similar to the sleep spell, but rather than doing hit points, it's just a saving throw. We have a petrification ray, a disintegration ray, and then just the straight up death ray. I also do find it's interesting. I always thought it was kind of weird that the enervation ray does 8d8 necrotic damage, but then the death ray also does necrotic damage. And the only difference is the enervation ray just does damage, whereas the death ray, just if you go to 0 hit points, you immediately die and don't make death saves. But yeah, again, a quintessential monster from Dungeons & Dragons, and I highly recommend you check out the section in Volo's Guide to Monsters on Beholders, because there's a bunch of different, I think it's Volo's, that shows off a bunch of the different ways they can be configured, and again, the lore behind them and how they're birthed is just amazing. Number 7. Yet another eye-based monster here is the Nothic. These guys are a little on the lower level here, right? They are only challenge rating 2. They don't have anything too crazy, but they can mess up a low-level party. They do have true sight, so nobody's sneaking by them with invisibility. They do have advantage on perception checks as well. They have great, claws, nothing crazy, but they do have this rotting gaze ability, which can just do necrotic damage. It only works on 1 creature, but again, it's only a Constitution save of 12, and it's only 3d6 damage. But my favorite part is the weird insight ability. So it targets a creature within 30 feet, and they must make a deception check against its insight check. And if it wins, it learns 1 fact or secret about the target, and the target automatically wins if it's immune to being charmed. But I always find that interesting because I'm never really sure how to go about doing that in game. Like if I'm just like, hey, make me a deception check, and they're like, what for? And I'm like, don't worry about it. And it makes the check, and then I'm like, hey, tell me a fact or secret about you. And then they're like, why? And I was like, don't, and then they tell me. And if it's like a secret, then you have to deal with the whole concept of the other players hearing. But then it's just like, I like kind of doing the eerie, you feel as though somewhere someone has learned that. And it's just like, oh, that's kind of weird. And it can just add paranoia to the party. And it can just be a fun time for you, I think. There's also a lot of interesting lore about them once being wizards and then bad stuff happening to them, and that's how they ended up. Let's see. Rather than a godlike supremacy, some wizards devote their lives to unearthing arcane secrets, and then basically it's a transformation into this weird creature. And again, also very cool stuff. Number 6. The Red Slaad. Who doesn't love a toad mixed with a xenomorph, or I guess more accurately, a facehugger from the Alien series? And that is about as close as you're going to get when it comes to a Red Slaad. These are sort of weird creatures from Limbo, and I mean, the art is awesome. I love the art on these guys. But what's really kind of what puts them on my list are these claws, which look nasty, sure, but they have so much more than that. I guess I should also state that Slaads have resistance to acid, cold, fire, lightning, and thunder, so all elemental damage. They have advantage on saving throws against magic, and they regenerate hit points every turn as long as they have 1 hit point, and nothing shuts down that regen. They can make their bite attacks and claw attacks, but here's the thing. If the target is a humanoid, and they succeed on a DC 4, or they don't succeed on a DC 14 con save, they're infected with a disease, which is basically being injected with a tiny Slaad egg. They carry that host to term over 3 months. The egg moves to the chest cavity, gestates, and then forms a Slaad tadpole, which, as a xenomorph does, bursts out of their chest cavity. In the 24-hour period before giving birth, they start to feel unwell, their speed is halved, they have disadvantage on attack rolls, ability checks, and saving throws, and at birth, the tadpole chews its way through the vital organs and out of the host's chest in a singular round, killing them in the process. If you happen to cure the disease beforehand, the Slaad doesn't emerge, and this, I feel like, is 100% a situation you find yourself in if you don't, if you're unaware of the lore. Right, which is always a weird problem in my mind that comes with like metagaming but not metagaming. Like if I know that someone gets hit with a red claw from a Slaad, I, Ted, know that they're impregnated with a diseased, an egg that's going to burst out of their chest, but my character might not know. So then comes the interesting concept of, do I know to cast like lesser restoration or greater restoration on this person? Probably not. Because, but then like I, Ted, know. But either way, it's also how they reproduce, or one of the few ways in which they reproduce. Another is blue Slaads can actually just turn people into Slaads, which is pretty cool. I really, really like Slaads a lot. And there's what's something else you may not know is there's a lot more different variety of Slaads than just the ones covered in the monster manual. I know we have like red, blue, green, I think gray and death or something like that, but there are a variety of other colors of Slaad as well. So check out older editions for more info on that. Number 5. The Neothelid. If you are familiar with Mind Flayers, then chances are, at least in some degree, or if you're familiar with Baldur's Gate 3, you are familiar with the process of ceremorphosis. This is how Mind Flayers make more Mind Flayers. They have a large pool of tadpoles, usually surrounding the elder brain, and one of those tadpoles is removed and inserted into the eye socket of a living humanoid creature, and over the course of several days, they transform into a new Mind Flayer. Well, what happens if adventurers kill an entire Mind Flayer colony, including the elder brain, and all of those tadpoles are left to their own devices? Well, they'll fight and vie for superiority, and eventually one will become the supreme winner of this fight and be the only one to survive, and as it continues to grow, it will turn into this gargantuan, terrifying monstrosity, the Neothelid. They are also feared immensely by Mind Flayers because they don't have intelligence, and therefore are immune to most of the Mind Flayers' tactics for how they subdue and defeat creatures. So Mind Flayers don't allow this to happen, as do Elder Brains, but if adventurers don't know the process of defeating, of destroying every singular tadpole, one of these can be left to live. They don't have any eyes, as you saw, so they have blind sight. They can sense the presence of any creature within 1 mile that has intelligence, sort of a leftover bit from the Mind Flayer days. A creature protected by Mind Blank and non-detection are immune to this. They also have some innate abilities, which is terrifying because one of those is Levitate, which this is a giant worm, doesn't have a burrowing speed, but it can, in theory, float via Levitate. And then also has the following spells: once per day, Confusion, Feeble Mind, and Telekinesis. Feeble Mind is a terrifying spell, and again, it could use Telekinesis to fly if it wanted to, as well as having magic resistance. It has these 15-foot reach tentacles that do bludgeoning damage and psychic damage. If you're a large or smaller creature, you're grappled. Let's see. If they must succeed on a strength saving throw or be swallowed. It's a DC 18 strength saving throw, by the way. While blinded, the standard swallowed whole thing, blinded, restrained, you'll take acid damage at the start of your turn. If you do damage, it'll be enough to regurgitate you. It also has a breath weapon, if that wasn't enough, a 60-foot cone breath weapon that does 10d6 acid damage. They are awesome and terrifying, and it's always a fun thing to have to deal with. Like, if your players unfortunately find themselves in a Mind Flayer colony and defeat them, if they don't, this can be a fun return to form when this thing eventually grows to its full size, and then they have to come back and deal with more. Although the tactics will be largely different. Number 4. The Death Kiss. This is a Beholderkin that, instead of having eye stalks, has little sucker mouths on the end of its arms, or its tentacles, as you would. I also like that they can shrink all of their tentacles inside to basically just become a floating bloodshot eyeball, which is kind of interesting. Immunity to lightning, which I also thought was kind of weird. And a creature within 5 feet of it takes lightning damage whenever it hits it with a melee attack. And then it can make 3 tentacle attacks a turn, or one of those can be replaced with a blood drain attack. Its tentacles have 20-foot reach, so it's pretty lengthy there. Does piercing damage, and they're grappled. While grappled, they're restrained. And if they're grappled by a tentacle, it can again replace one of those tentacle attacks with a blood drain, where they make a con save and take 4d10 lightning damage, and it regains half as many hit points. As we've already discussed, Mind Flayers, Beholders have an interesting way in which new Beholders are born. Basically, they dream them into existence. And one of the interesting things, I think, is it says right here, a Death Kiss is a lesser Beholder that might come into being when a Beholder has a vivid nightmare about losing blood. Instead of magical eye rays, it's 10 long tentacles, each ending in a mouthful of teeth. So, like, if it got stabbed and it was thinking about bleeding, if it was dreaming about bleeding, it might dream a Death Kiss into existence. So it says they survive solely on ingested blood, which powers the electrical energy inside their body. And they lack kind of the intelligence. If you see, they have a humanoid intelligence of a 10, so it's nothing too crazy. But yeah, I think they're pretty interesting. I like to have the concept of them possibly being somehow tied to a vampire would also be a fun thing. So it says they'll also submit to the rule of a true Beholder, so they can have a fun concept of a Beholder with Death Kiss minions. But yeah, I like them a lot. I think they're interesting. I have a mini of them, which also helps sell them to me. But I think it would be cool to have them sort of as, like, bloodsucker minions of a vampire. Could be a really interesting encounter. Number 3. You knew they had to be on here in some capacity, so we have our Mind Flayer, or in this particular case, the Ulitharid, which is sort of a supreme, crazy, powerful Mind Flayer that has 6 tentacles instead of the standard 4. And there really is no kind of method. It's just basically one time in a rare situation, a tadpole from the brine pool of the Elder Brain will turn an individual into a Ulitharid as opposed to a standard Mind Flayer. And they are sort of the pinnacle of Mind Flayer technology, Mind Flayer society. And it usually becomes like a pseudo leader alongside the Elder Brain. And then if the Elder Brain, it also is interesting if they become like insufferable. It says right here, they will move off from the Elder Brain and basically start and form a whole new Mind Flayer colony. And it says, after the death of a Ulitharid's body, Mind Flayers take its brain and place it in the brine pool, where it grows into an Elder Brain. So that's a very interesting way they have to propagate Mind Flayer society. So they have ridiculous stats, a ton of skills and high saving throws, telepathy out to 2 miles, dark vision. They have the same kind of creature sensibility, works out to 2 miles as well, magic resistance. They can be a psionic hub for an Elder Brain. And they have their innate psionic abilities in detect thought and levitate at will. And then once a day, confusion, dominate monster, eye bite, feeble mind, mass suggestion, plane shift, project image, scrying, and telekinesis. Their tentacles have a 10-foot reach, do 4d10 psychic damage, and grapple people. And if you're grappled by one, you must make an intelligence saving throw or be stunned. It has its extract brain ability, as you would expect, right? If someone is grappled, incapacitated, and grappled by it, they take 10d10 piercing damage, and if it reduces them to 0, it pulls their brain out. And then it has its, Mind Flayer Mind Blast, a 60-foot cone, and an intelligence saving throw, take 4d12 psychic damage and be stunned. So between the tentacles, the Mind Blast, and the extract brain, you have a pretty good chance of getting that brain if you need it. But then you also have things like feeble mind, dominate monster, mass suggestion, a lot of ways to get someone into a situation where you can do what you want with them and get their brain. So also the art is fantastic. I love this art. And I don't think it's listed here, but there's also the Ulitharid, which is an undead lich version, kind of a Ulitharid, which I also very much like. And I knew I was going to put Mind Flayers on here in some capacity, but this is just the coolest epitome of Mind Flayers, so they were the one that won out. Number 2. The Aboleth. Aboleths I like a lot because they are a very interesting creature, and this is another one that falls into the lore section because they predate the gods. And I'm not going to dive into, I'm not a lore channel, right? There's tons of information out there on Aboleths, but they have some crazy abilities, and their history and existence is one of the most interesting ones in D&D lore in my mind. So they are sort of an amphibious creature. They have very slow land speed, but do have a good swim speed. They generate a mucus cloud when they're underwater, which is pretty dangerous, right? A creature that touches it or hits it with a melee attack must make a con save. On a failure, they're diseased for a d4 hours and can only breathe underwater. They communicate telepathically. If anyone communicates with them, the Aboleth learns their greatest desires if it can see the creature. It has its tentacle attacks, which have a 10-foot reach, bludgeoning damage, and then you need to make a con save or be diseased. The disease has no effect for 1 minute and can be removed with anything that removes disease. However, the interesting part, after a minute, only a minute, folks, the creature's skin becomes translucent and slimy. They can't regain hit points unless they're underwater, and the disease can only be healed by a heal or 6th level or higher healing spell. When out of water, you take a d12 acid damage every 10 minutes unless moisture is applied to the skin before 10 minutes have passed. So if it hits you with a tentacle and you fail that con save, you basically have a minute to cure it, or you will basically become an aquatic creature that will take acid damage every time you leave the area unless you constantly moisturize. You can't heal unless you're underwater, and it takes a 6th level or higher healing spell to even end this effect. It has its tail attack, which does some bludgeoning damage, and it has 3 times per day the Enslave ability, which it targets a creature within 30 feet. They make a wisdom saving throw or become charmed by the Aboleth. And until that time, they're basically under its control, can't take reactions, and it can target, and they can communicate telepathically. And whenever charmed, the target can repeat the saving throw. On a success, it ends. Whenever they take damage. So if the Aboleth is smart about how it does this and doesn't damage you, and your party doesn't feel like hurting you, then you basically will stay in its enthrall for as long as it takes. It also has legendary actions, perception check, a tail swipe, or psychic drain. It has one creature that is charmed by it, can take 3d6 psychic damage, and it regains hit points equal to that damage. So if it charms you, it can then kind of use you as a soul battery to charge itself back up. but in doing so, you take damage, which prompts a saving throw. It also has several different interesting lair actions. The fact that it can just cast Phantasmal Force, which is a debilitating spell, depending on your imagination. And again, like I said, the fact that they have memories and existence prior to the gods of the realms are pretty interesting. Also, a bummer that there's only kind of one version of an Aboleth in 5th edition, as far as I know. There are other versions with different transformations and multiple eyes and all sorts of interesting stuff in older editions, which I hope to see make a return in 5e. Number 1. And if you know anything about me, it should be no surprise that my number 1 is the Flumph. They are a lawful good aberration that I think are just goofy and silly, and I love them. They help adventurers. They travel around the Underdark using jets of air to traverse and fly, and it kind of sounds like Flumph, and that's where their name came from. They're pretty smart and wise. They can communicate telepathically with any creature within 60 feet of them. It's interesting that if you knock them prone, they could be upside down, almost like a turtle, and they're kind of stuck like that, which I think is funny. And they are immune to any effects that would sense their emotions or read their thoughts. They have their little tendrils, so they're sort of like a turtle jellyfish creature, which does piercing damage and acid damage. And then if you're hit by one, you must make a con save or take acid damage kind of recurring as this acid is applied to you, and then add a turtle's vulnerability of being upside down, a jellyfish's sting, a snail's eye stalks, and a skunk's spray. And that is the Flumph, right? They have a stench spray, a 15-foot cone. You must succeed on a DC 10 dex save or be coated in foul-smelling liquid. For a D4 hours, you are poisoned as long as that is there. And a creature can remove the stench on itself by using a short rest to bathe in water, alcohol, or vinegar. And they feed off of sort of psionic energy, which I thought is also interesting. So you can find them around like significantly more brutal things like Mind Flayers, Aboleths, or Gith. They're sort of a passive parasite that they just take the energy they need to survive. And it says, consuming the psionic energy reveals the thoughts and emotions of the creatures on which it feeds. But since so many of them are evil, they hunger, it sickens their pure nature. When Flumphs encounter good-hearted adventurers, they eagerly share the dark secrets they have learned in hopes of casting down the evil sources of energy, and then possibly using the players to get that energy that they need. It also says they live in complex and organized groups called cloisters, within which each Flumph has a place and purpose. These harmonious groups have no need for leaders, since they all contribute in their own way. There's also a really cool piece of art that exists that I've seen on the internet of like a Flumph fighter, where one of his eye stalks is replaced with a shield, and he's got like a dagger and a rolled up in his. I'll see if I can find it. I can seemingly only. I don't know who the original art is by, but I can only find it now apparently in tattoo form on someone. But I'll show you it right here, right? So it's this. He's got like a shield eye stalk. He's got like a couple of swords and a shield here, like spikes on the end of his tendrils. It's interesting to me that I can only find it now in in the tattoo form, but I thought that was cool. Also, I think it'd be a really ridiculously fun character to play if your DM would let you play a Flumph, but I don't know. Anyway, folks, that is my top 10 aberrations. I've obviously fallen back in love with aberrations playing Baldur's Gate 3. There's a big focus there on Mind Flayers, as everyone is aware. So it's kind of put it more at the forefront of my mind. But yeah, I really like them. The Flumphs also kind of remind me of slimes from the Monster Hunter, or not Monster Hunter series, Dragon Warrior. I don't know why I went with Monster Hunter, but anyway. Yeah, thank you all so much for watching. Thank you for continuing to subscribe to the channel. Those numbers continue to rise, and I do think we still stand a pretty good shot of hitting 100,000 subscribers by my birthday in July. Thank you again to my patrons over on Patreon for continuing to support me and the channel, and I will see you all next time.